I'm joined by five of some of my favorite colleagues in this field who I've had the pleasure of sitting with for the last day and a half and are going to continue working with tomorrow as well, just to think through some of the thorny questions that a lot of us think through individually in our work, and it's nice to do that with a crowd. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of them. I'll open by sort of setting the scene a bit. We're each only going to talk for about 5 to 8 minutes about sort of the work that we do and what role data plays in that. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, and we're really eager to hear both your questions and experiences from your own studies and your own disciplines where you might have relevant things to teach us about how we could better use data to push our work forward. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. I'll introduce us in order of speaking. So I'm joined by my colleague Duncan Jepson. He's the founder and managing director of Liberty Asia, which is a Hong Kong-based organization focused on preventing human trafficking through legal advocacy, technological interventions, and strategic collaboration in Asia and beyond. And Duncan will talk to us specifically about the use of open source data in establishing industry liability in the anti-trafficking movement. My colleague Sarah Jekyll, she's worked on this issue for well over a decade and spent a lot of that time at Polaris, which is an organization many of you have probably heard of, as their chief program officer, and she's now an independent consultant working with various organizations in the counter-trafficking field. Karen Snyder is a doctoral trained social scientist with over 2 decades of experience improving policies and practices in the anti-trafficking movement, health, and the environment, and most recently served for several years as the director of monitoring, learning, and evaluation at Free the Slaves, which is another DC-based anti-trafficking organization that you all may have heard of. She'll speak to us about how NGOs use data to evaluate their impact and interventions. And sorry, I should have mentioned Sarah's going to speak to us about her work at Polaris and sort of getting a large anti-trafficking organization off the ground, specifically with a focus on setting up their hotlines, which is a model that, as you know, has been replicated widely throughout the world, a lot of times with help from Polaris. My colleague Luis Fabiano de Assis, he is a federal prosecutor and the chief research and data officer at the Federal Labor Prosecution Office in Brazil and a law and policy professor at the National School of Public Prosecutors there. And he will talk to us about sort of how he pushes the boundaries of what governments think is possible with their data. And lastly, but certainly not least, my colleague Nathaniel Erb. He runs Urban Associates, which helps NGOs, governments, investors, and others to develop solutions to human trafficking and related issues through legislation and other means. So with that, I'll go ahead and get us started. Oh, sorry. And Nathan's going to talk about how to build effective solutions with and for multiple actors and stakeholders. So I'm going to set myself a timer because I have a tendency to talk long, as do some of my colleagues, and so this will help me stay in check. So anyway, I guess I'll set the scene by saying how I got started in this work. So when I was actually a grad student here at Stanford, I was supporting a professor who was writing a book on trafficking. This was about 5 years ago. So I started getting really interested in the issue, and like one does, I started by looking up what is the data? Like, what are the statistics? What is this issue? How big is the problem, et cetera? And I found a lot of the numbers that you may or may not be familiar with, the most recent being, there's 40.3 million people enslaved at any given point in time in the world. About 3/4 of them are women and girls. You may have seen the estimate that $150 billion a year is made by traffickers. And I was kind of immediately concerned because, first of all, I was like, okay, where do these numbers come from? They're really big, they seem unwieldy, and they're not really telling me a lot about what this issue actually looks like. And so I started, and then of course I was also like, and they're all estimates, often derived in hard data. In the case of like the 40.3 million prevalence estimate, there is, data coming from governments or data coming from random sample surveys that supports the creation of those numbers, but then there's a lot of statistical extrapolation that's done from there. And so I started thinking, okay, well, I want to learn actually what's happening on the, sort of at at the ground level, and how do we actually craft interventions and policies to end this practice. And it didn't seem like those numbers were a really helpful starting place for me. They're obviously very important for advocacy purposes and drawing attention to the issue, and I have been very excited to see throughout my time in the anti-trafficking field just the amount of attention that is being paid to this issue has grown exponentially, and that's super exciting and owed a lot to the hard work of folks at the International Labor Organization and Walk Free Foundation and others who are generating numbers like this. The other issue that I started to grapple with more recently, I think being based in the Silicon Valley leads a lot to this, is like all the exciting work that's being done around, digitization of data, and we have all these new methods that we can use to do big data analysis. We have all these emerging technologies, and how do we use mobile phone apps, and there's a lot of cool stuff being done around that. People using mobile phone apps to record worker voice in factories in Myanmar, or Thorn, based here in SF, that's using algorithms to comb Backpage to look for trends in posts that they think are related to child sex workers, child sex victims, or the Rights Lab at University of Nottingham that's using sort of geospatial data to look for indicators of trafficking. And this is all like really exciting and important work. But it just really hit me that that is not the environment that a lot of folks in the anti-trafficking movement are operating in, both in terms of the resources that they have available to them, the technical capacity and support that they have, the time to devote to answering these big questions. And so I decided I wanted to learn more, and so I've just finished a large research project specifically looking in Southeast Asia to understand how our systems built, how are organizations both in civil society and governments setting up systems to record their data. What are the research questions, or they don't necessarily think of them that way, but what are the objectives of the organization that they're aiming to serve by being able to intake this information? How do they use it to shape their work and evaluate their impact, which is a point that I think Karen will dig into a lot more later. Because like I said, those larger numbers are not necessarily helping us get at these discrete questions of things like, what makes an awareness-raising campaign effective in the first place, or why is a given industry more ripe towards exploitation than another? How can the movement better evaluate the quality of its own work and the services that we are, that folks are respectively providing? And the reason I looked at Southeast Asia in particular was because last year, ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, it's a regional economic community in Southeast Asia comprised of 10 member states. They ratified a convention on trafficking, which is it's like a really big deal, and only their fourth convention as a body, so it has a lot of potential to have an impact. And one of the stipulations of the related plan of action for the ACTIP is that they will establish a regional anti-trafficking database. And so of course I was like, what's going to go into this database? What does ASEAN want to know? And when I talked to the body of folks that are going to be in charge of that, it wasn't expressly clear at the outset that there was a thought going into what it would record. Would it be cases? Most likely, I imagine it'll end up being cases from a criminal justice perspective, reported cases of trafficking that may or may not be integrated into social services data in terms of what services are being provided to survivors and things like that. And so my big concern was okay, I would like to not have this be another database that's set up as sort of an end in and of itself. During my work meeting with these organizations, I found very frequently that the creation of a system, which often there's also conflation of what is a data system and what is a database and sort of how they relate, but that the creation of the system itself became the product and the outcome. Whereas to me, a database is a tool that you can use to answer the questions you need to inform your work, right? So I wanted to make sure that that's not going to happen at a large regional level. And so I'm trying to work with ASEAN and support this database to be something that can be very useful to their work. other things I found in doing this field work is that the benefits of digital data just broadly are not really being realized, and that comes from, there's a number of challenges why a lot of NGOs and government agencies in this movement are still relying on Excel is probably the most common sort of database that's being used to record information, and often like quite complex information, you know, that you would maybe want to see in a relational database or otherwise, or even just like on paper a lot of times, or in a Word, just a free text Word document, which obviously can make it really difficult to do any kind of meaningful analysis. If systems have been set up, they're often created with like a very specific goal, either linked to a specific fund where they've received money and they have to report on certain metrics related to their monitoring and evaluation protocols. And it's also seen as, you know, data entry is seen as something that takes time away from actual service provision, particularly for those CSOs that are doing social work. At the end of a long day, they'd much rather be spending their time serving as many clients as possible than entering that data into a database. And this is one of the challenges this group is talking about, is how to sort of change the thinking to switch towards those conversations being about prevention and saying like there's a lot you could learn from that data to actually get the movement towards prevention. I'll just rattle through quickly since I'm out of time. Lack of infrastructure and technical support, which I already mentioned. This can be really, really basic challenges like reliable internet access or access to secured servers or things like that. I already spoke about the challenge of sort of databases as an outcome in and of themselves. And then the other thing I mentioned is this collaboration question, because I think a lot of us are really interested in that. Most of the countries where I was working have a national task force that's focused on anti-trafficking, and that's a collection of government representatives from relevant ministries like the department, or analogous to like DOJ and Homeland Security and social services, as well as NGO representatives who meet, monthly to talk about cases that they're seeing and look for trends and like modus operandi and things. And these bodies are they're not often sort of well funded, and they're not often given a strong mandate. And so I think that to me is an area where there's tremendous potential for impact around this question of better data. But right now, I don't really see them being utilized to that impact. So that's all to say there are certainly a lot of challenges in this geographical context, and that's certainly not unique to Southeast Asia by any means. This is a challenge that I've seen across the board. Even the Department of Health and Human Services is undertaking a review of U.S. government data on trafficking in the many places that it sits, and how we could better create interoperability across those systems, or at least agree on some basic terms. So with that, I will toss it over to Duncan, who also has a lot of experience in this context.
Thanks, Jessie. So I'm just going to open with a question to you guys. Who do you think is responsible for solving this problem of human trafficking?
All of us.
Yeah, but if you were going to start allocating activities, how would you allocate them out? I mean, the good thing about being all of us is it's not my problem, it's yours as well, which I really like. But if I'm going to arbitrage that responsibility, I'm going to do it pretty quickly.
I'll leave that to the students.
So anybody who's responsible? I mean, you can name some names like law enforcement, government companies. Anybody? This is Stanford. I want to see some thinking.
Corporations.
Okay, corporations. Good start.
Consumers.
Okay. Anyone else? Organised crime, anybody?
Legal system for harsher penalties for the traffickers.
Cool. So just taking consumers and corporations, which of those do you think should be liable? Both of them? I mean, who's going to pay out, right? I mean, you guys have all got phones. Should you be starting to pay back the fact that you've got these phones? I mean, I have one too. So are we liable as well as corporations?
philosophically?
Let's start with philosophically because it's the easiest.
Yes, there's
Okay.
responsibility.
But, so if we then move that from philosophically to let's make it happen, how does somebody hold you and I liable for what's happened to these people? And how do then we loop in and make sure those who are responsible actually do something about it?
It have to be some sort of strict liability because
It's a good start.
It's not like there's or like a motivation to, like, if you don't know.
Yeah. So we could definitely, if we subtract men's row, we could say, okay, maybe it was, which I think it is, diminished responsibility by society. So I think the reason you can't answer the question that's difficult is because truthfully nobody has the answer, and we find a situation in society where if you choose to make the phone or buy the fish or dig the hole in the ground and use forced labour, it is, as you will all probably know, a sustainability issue. It's an ethical issue. It's a corporate sustainability and a social responsibility issue. It isn't, oddly enough, a criminal issue. So, whilst you might, if you're at the bottom end of this and you are abusing someone and forcing them to work, and then with the thing that is made, you then sell it to someone, that person who takes it only really has an ethical issue. Even though they may know that they're selling it on and eventually it works its way into retailers, that's just an ethical problem. And that makes it very hard to hold people liable. And so when you cast yourself across the sort of legislation in the world of today, the US has some of the best legislation there is. And it being the largest economy, and of course the US dollar, gives it a power and I think a reach that no other country has. The problem is that it's very difficult with only one country having that reach, and the DOJ really not necessarily being interested in what happens in Cambodia or in the Congo or in Qatar. So you then have this issue where the fish from Thailand, as they work its way all the way to a retailer here, is how on earth do you decide how can you do something about that? So if I said to you, which is very common there, people are abused in Thailand, and that fish moves its way through somewhere like Singapore, makes its way to the US, just with 3 countries involved, who are we going to go to hold somebody liable? Is it the Thai law enforcement or US law enforcement? If we were an activist group, whose door should we be banging on? And would they even be interested in letting us in on the basis that they don't really have anything but an ethical obligation? And that's why the philosophical argument ends up being actually, currently, the only argument that there is. And of course I can assuage you all by just turning up here and saying, I'd like to speak to people about ethics and morality. And as a corporation go, I had a good conversation with a bunch of people about the ethics of what we're doing, and I think we learned a lot, and we're going to go away and do nothing. But we did come here, so that is at least something. And that creates the biggest problem. So for our charity and my background, which was as a general counsel of a large investment business across Asia for a decade or so, was could we use information to hold people accountable, maybe not liable, but start to place information in front of them. And that does differentiate. Should consumers be liable? I don't think so. Did they have knowledge of what they were going to buy? Did they deliberately buy it? Did they then sell it on and profit? These are important questions. But what we then decide is, okay, well, what information makes the difference? Well, if I'm a business and I decide I'm going to form a relationship with another business, I should be doing due diligence on that relationship. When I'm buying a house, or I'm buying a car, or I'm buying a phone, I do my research. I at least might look at some sort of ratings platform to decide whether it's any good. And I'd be the dummy to buy the 1-star product over the 5-star product unless somehow it made sense to me in some unique and idiosyncratic way. But the truth is, with business, is that you don't want to take the risk of all your business, all of your hard work being threatened because you start to have a relationship with somebody else. And so we can help provide information and make people say, well, I'm going to do business with you, but I'm going to hold you accountable. Where are your fish from? Where are they caught? And that's a starting point. Some people obviously are going to be actually convicted criminals, so you obviously don't want to do business with them, but the problem is they aren't going to necessarily tell you that. So you need data to find out who's been convicted, who's been involved, are they part of organised crime. All these things are available to some measure in some way because they attract legal risk themselves. I can go to a database and find out, say, sexual offenders, and that information, as you know, in this country in particular, is readily available, but not necessarily with human traffickers, and certainly not the case of those who are convicted in Cambodia or Laos or Qatar or so forth. So I'm going to have to do a bit of digging. But if I get it and I realise that I can make it available, then why wouldn't I share it with everybody else? There's a downside to that. Is that fair? Someone who committed a crime 15 years ago and has done their best. There is no answer to this question because, getting back to it, we haven't really figured out, as you said, how on earth we make people liable for this. So there's all these questions that, you know, my NGO and others around trying to solve these problems, but you undoubtedly will inherit if you want to do this kind of work. The next part is the police and the courts. You know, in the US, actually it's very reliable, although there's different opinions if you live. I'm not a US citizen. But if you're going to the courts, and we've done work with undercover work with, for instance, the Thai police, and one of the first things that we ever got involved with, a person on the police was actually being paid off, and so the whole mission fell apart. Simple things made a difference. With the current laws in, say, Thailand, you can only take a kid out of that if that kid shows the abuse and there's evidence of it. It takes about 2 days for a bruise to start to well up. So if you went in there and took the kid before the bruise had appeared, you have no evidence that there's been any physical abuse. So you need to identify the kid, wait 2 days. The problem is if you're an NGO and you want to post numbers of saving victims and you go in there on day one, then when the police look at the child on day one, they'll say, but there's no evidence of abuse there. And then the child goes back, and this happens. Actually, the child just completely disappears from the system again and is moved elsewhere. And that's a problem because when you think about data and evidence, these things, one might say, well, they work against doing what is the right thing. But in order to make sure that these things then disappear, you need to then have strong evidence to actually show that the law should change. And the sad story that I've told you, unfortunately, is not the thing that's going to change. What is going to change it is evidence within the legal system itself. You know, the issue about whether there should be mens rea, whether there should be intent, whether it should be reckless. And so evidence is not just about these activities occurring and all of the data signals come up. It's about how the system itself is functioning. And I was on the call this morning with some of my team. We were talking about how we move data around for Western Union and for certain data providers like Thomson Reuters who provide information on criminals. And what I'm interested in is, yeah, we've moved 10,000 names in the last 2 years of people who are convicted of trafficking. We know where they've gone. They've gone to 9,000 banks and 2,000 non-financial companies. But what we don't know is where they should be going, but they can't get to. And so there's these huge black spots around the planet where no data flows. And that's really part of the challenge as well. So I'm going to leave it there. How's that?
Right. I know. I was just about to give you the 2-minute sign. You just knocked it out of the park.
You doubted me.
That was fail.
Thank you. Yes, very. So I think I will start with a question too, and I'm so loud naturally that I'm not necessarily sure that I need this, but I'll put it a little bit away so I don't blast your ears. If you were trying to find out where and how human trafficking was happening, where do you think you would look? Where do you think you would get the most information and data on where and how human trafficking is happening? Throw anything out there. Online forums. Sketchy online forums, things like Backpage or other places where there might be individuals for sale. Where else? NGOs, definitely. Frontline workers who are hearing the stories every day of what's actually happening on the ground. Where else?
Tip report?
Say again?
The U.S. tip report?
The tip report? Absolutely. Looking at country narratives, hearing back. What's the single source where we would get the most accurate experience of what trafficking looks and feels like, though? Nobody said it yet. Survivors of trafficking. So my first job at Polaris in 2007 was to build and launch the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So we had about 9 weeks to build out the infrastructure, to create a referral network across the country, to build out our law enforcement partners, and to understand what kind of data and information we were going to collect. My first stop was other national hotlines. How did they do it? What did they collect? And the reality is the issue of trafficking is quite different and quite distinct from, for example, the National Suicide Hotline or even the National Domestic Violence Hotline. We were interested in collecting and gathering a significantly larger and different type of information. So from the very beginning, we started off with extremely complex forms that I had created. Those extremely complex color-coded forms lasted about 2.5 weeks, and then we switched to a cloud-based system called Salesforce. So we built out a customized database in a CRM, Salesforce Online, that allowed us to collect up to 120 different data variables. Those data variables were not something that we got on every call. Everything was directed by the caller and their needs and what they were looking for, but it created a space where we were often getting information about their experience, what it looked like, what it felt like, that we could use for other purposes. So in our first full year of operation, we were getting about 400 calls a month. That was 2008. By 2017 or 18, 10 years later, that number was about 4,000 a month. And it was calls, emails, text messages, chats, online reports that were all coming in from survivors. And when we looked at that, we look at each of those individual calls or inquiries or signals coming in as a possible opportunity to understand where and how human trafficking is happening and to collect more information. What we sort of quickly realized, and what I'm sharing with you now, is just sort of a case study of a single NGO and how we interacted with and built up our capacity to understand and drive forward an agenda that was data-driven and informed. When we dug into hotlines, we sort of realized that they had two massive purposes. The first and foremost, of course, was to create a vital safety net for survivors. We were supporting individuals on the ground who were in a crisis and needed access to help. In that context, we were also building referral partnerships on the ground. We were helping states to talk to each other so that people weren't reinventing the wheel, so that every single state wasn't spending money on their human trafficking identification training, for example. We were also forcing states to create response protocols. And not just response protocols for child sex trafficking, but for adult sex trafficking, for labor trafficking, for cases that involved different types of communities. Because when we called with a tip and they didn't have a response, the onus was then on the state to sort of push forward and understand that. We also created, sort of exposed where we didn't have services. There weren't services in rural areas. There weren't services for the LGBTQ community. There weren't, frankly, services for labor trafficking victims in most places. So we were also, by data, by saying what calls we were getting, what calls we were getting and what calls we weren't getting, we were showing people what type of services were out there and what was missing. The second primary massive purpose for hotlines was that they were a way to capture primary data. We were understanding what the victim's experience was like, how they were recruited, what were their vulnerabilities, what were, for example, the systems that they interacted with that failed to identify them along the way, whether that was the child welfare system, whether that was a school. All of this became information. But when we first sort of sat down to run a national hotline, this wasn't necessarily the conception that was there, but it is the conception that developed. And over time, the basis of the national hotline, 2 minutes already, I'm in trouble, Jessie. I'm taking Duncan's 2 minutes. The hotlines were really the basis for all of the programs that we launched later on. So in 2012, we launched our Global Hotlines program, which was focused on building a global modern slavery directory. That was data and information about all the actors that were out there. It was also focused on replicating the hotline in the UK. We built the Modern Slavery Helpline in the United Kingdom, the National Human Trafficking Helpline in Mexico. And it was also about building out our data analysis program. So 2013 became the year that we launched our next program based on data. where we could really focus on understanding trafficking networks type by type. What was the business model? What type of advertising were they doing? Was it a singular person, or was it a wide transnational criminal organized network? Really, what did it look like and how did it function? And after 10 years, in 2017, we eventually published the typology of slavery in the United States, of modern slavery in the United States, where we broke down into the 25 major types of trafficking that we had seen, that had come across through human trafficking hotline data. And that became basically a blueprint. How could we tackle each network type by type? And we started to launch programming, first in the illicit massage business area, and second with sex trafficking of women and girls from Mexico and Latin America, that was focused on the fact that those were specific types that we had information about how they functioned, so that we could move upstream and eventually prevent data. Functionally, what we're looking at with data is always about prevention. We're not collecting data for data's sake. We are collecting data so that we can prevent another victim from becoming victimized down the road. So I'll stop there.
Is it my turn? Okay, great. Okay, so what you guys are getting from this panel today is really pretty cool, because we work at lots of different levels, and you're going to keep hearing this as we keep talking. It's really it's really fun to be in a group like this where we all are coming from different, not that we're coming from different perspectives, is that we're working at different angles and different ways on the same issue. So I want my question for you guys before is, how many of you were in the human rights class? And the rest of you are from other departments? You said you're from business school. Were other places? Just give me an idea of who's here, please.
And social works,
Public health.
law, social health. Anyone see that?
Are there computer sciencey people or math people or a little bit data science? Yeah. Okay. Engineering. Yeah. Okay. Great. So where I'm going to give you more is this. That's hissing, isn't it? I'm going to put that. So the place that I'm the context of my work, as Jessie said, is the anti-trafficking and helping the environment. But the work that I do is what's called evaluation, and what that means is that I help organizations and governments and academics actually help figure out what is it that you're actually trying to achieve. What are you really trying to do, and what do you think it's going to take to get you there? And then how are you doing at it, and how can you do it better? So there's a whole world out there of evaluation, which I never knew about until long postgraduate school. But there are degrees in this now, and it's a really interesting field to go into for those of you in these areas. And so the example I'm going to give is about working with an NGO that's based in Washington, D.C. called Free the Slaves, but that works with local grassroots organizations in Nepal and India and Congo, Senegal, Ghana, Haiti, used to work in Brazil. India, thank you. Did I say India? Nepal, India. I just put them together. And the organization uses what they call a community-based approach. So the idea is that the U.S. NGO provides funding and organizational capacity support to local grassroots organizations that are the frontline workers around human trafficking and modern slavery in these countries, and that they are the groups that actually do and carry out the work in local communities. And the work is really kind of holistic and comprehensive, and that's the idea, is that it is in fact freeing people and rescuing people from conditions of slavery, providing survivor support and reintegration back into communities. It also includes rule of law work, so that can be everything from supporting arrests and prosecutions and convictions and training officials to also doing a lot of advocacy work at kind of national levels to implement laws. It also includes sort of community mobilization. So raising awareness about the issues, and then getting communities to develop their own action plans and carry out work to remove trafficking from those communities. And then the final part is kind of socioeconomic support, so helping decrease the vulnerability. So that could be everything from helping get kids into schools to providing income generation projects to getting access to health cards, things like that. So the reason I'm telling you about all that is that if you want to be an evaluator and you're saying, okay, we have this model and we're doing it in all these countries, and the program that we're working at is this idea is that it's working in communities, the organization needed to think about how are we going to develop a way to see, is this working, is what's working in India also working in Ghana, or how are we doing our work across all of these places. So Sarah was just talking about going to getting primary information from whom? From survivors, right? From individuals. Now, what I've been describing is working with communities, right? And so one of the things that freed slaves decided to do, among many other kinds of ways to do, was say, well, if we're working at community level, then our unit of analysis, or the area where we want to see if we're making a difference, should be the community. It's not a right or wrong, it's not an either or. We did lots of other individual stuff as well, but the example that I wanted to talk to you guys about was sort of this idea of how do you measure whether there's been change at the community level. And so what they did was said, what would be determined to be success, right? And success would be if there is no more trafficking or slavery in a community. And that can depend on the country and the place and the circumstance. So in India, where a lot of the communities that they work in, there's a lot of debt bondage. That may be different from a community in Haiti, where a lot of the focus is on reste avec and children that are sent away for domestic service, right? So thinking about, already you got to think about what are the kinds of issues that you're talking about. So what they developed was what we called a community maturity tool. And this tool it's like, have you guys ever done like a focus group or something like that? So it's kind of like a focus group where you get a group of people together from the community and you have a series of statements in a series of areas. So they're kind of the basic one. There is no more slavery or trafficking in our community, yes or no? Survivors in our community receive access to support and care services. Survivors in our community are treated and receive the same, are living without stigma. Children in our community are going to school and they're not working outside, or they're not working instead of going to school. Our community has law enforcement that knows what to do if there's a case of trafficking here. Kind of like a whole series, like kind of questions and statements like this. And so the idea is that a group gets together once a year and kind of goes through all of these questions and comes to agreement. And in fact, in some communities that are a bit bigger, what they'll do is they'll do like several groups and then sort of compile all the results. And then what the organization does, this little community organization, is they kind of get a score. And if they can compare from one year to the next, and they can also target their work. So it seems like that there's a lot of, everybody says that, these community groups would include survivors. And so everybody says, yeah, our kids are in school, then the organization doesn't need to put a lot of energy into getting kids into school. They can focus on other areas for the next year. And the idea that works with this really nicely as well is that for once they achieve a certain score on this kind of tool, the community groups and the local organization can say, okay, do we need to spend, the local organization can say, our resources are limited, we've only got so many community mobilizers, do we need to spend more time in this community, or can we move on to somewhere else, right? And so it allows the community organizations to think about how they're distributing their resources. And what often happens, in fact, is that the community members from certain communities, they actually go and start working in other communities as well, where their families live or other places as well. So I'm going to stop at that. The other cool thing about this that I wanted to say is that this idea of thinking about community as your unit of analysis or thinking about community, again, it's not to the exclusion of individuals or other things, but what it also has been able to do is to start integration with other kinds of like community development projects. So let's say there's an agriculture development project or a public health project or something else. They can start integrating the measures or how they're showing whether that's making a difference in this community with these anti-slavery wardens, because we're all talking about reducing vulnerabilities in these areas altogether for the whole population. So that's where I'm going to stop.
I was cutting the content to fit the time. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here to talk about how to push the boundaries of what governments think is possible with the data they have. To push the boundaries, pretty much what we're talking about when we're after all, we're in Silicon Valley, Stanford, right? So we're all students. I'm also a student. I'm like forever a student. So, and after all, we're talking about complex problems that proven to be resistant to change. So we always have to push the boundaries, right? So I brought to this seminar a case study from our office that shows a way of moving forward with data. I'm going to show you some, leaflets, some information after the meeting, and we can talk more later on. But first of all, I'll bring some background information about our prosecution office. Oh, I'm going to start counting my time. Well, I have 30 seconds. Consider mine. Well, the Labor Prosecution Office in Brazil is an independent prosecution agency that aims to protect fundamental rights at work. We don't have many similar experiences around the world. Maybe the Fair Work Ombudsman in Australia, it's pretty much similar to our legal framework in relation to the prosecution services. We aim to protect fundamental rights at work with a strategic focus on the eradication of forced labor, child labor, human trafficking, and also on the promotion of occupational safety and health, and freedom of association, equality at work, etc. So we represent the rights of vulnerable populations at work, bringing to courts individual and collective lawsuits similar to your class actions here in the United States, aiming at law enforcement, compensation, punitive damages, mostly with civil litigation, in addition to the traditional criminal litigation. In most cases, the money raised with fines is used to repair the harm caused, in many ways, ranging from supporting building schools or supporting academic research, improving healthcare systems, and etc. And investigations may lead also to commitment agreements. I'm going to give you an example of that here today in relation to the case, with timelines and fines prescribed either to resolve the dispute or to set out activities that private or governmental entities must take to address the violations or even a policy issue. So the independency of the prosecution service in Brazil sort of like a fourth branch in addition to the judiciary, the executive power and the legislative power. Sorry for my rusty English. It's really important in a country like mine, because we have a big deal with facing corruption scandals all the time. We have huge gaps in terms of accountability systems and rule of law at large, and human rights protection also. Yet in Brazil, and according to my research, in most countries around the world, the same happens. We have lots of opportunities when it comes to using data to promote social change, transform data into impact and to sustainable social change, and even to rethink what human trafficking data is, as the problem has its roots in the society. So we have learned from our experience that the idea of human trafficking data must be broader than we are used to think. So through data, it's important to try to understand what happened before the victims became victims, and during the process in which they're being victimized, and also what happens after the liberation to empower the victim and to prevent them to, in relation to recidivism. So the case I'm going to talk about involves a central issue. We start the case, okay? A central issue in the creation of effective counter-trafficking policies and policies at large, I would say. We all agree that policies in general, they need to be data-driven, okay, resilient to government changes or spur-of-the-moment politics, right? And they need to be sustainable, okay? Policies in general, a state asset. They should be seen as a state asset. Public good that should be free from pressure group interference, corporate, issues and stuff like that. In addition, good data-driven policy must have institutional backing to ensure their implementation over the time and under the rule of law. So it's not only about transforming data into information. That's not make sense in most situations where the people are not ready for using the information to make an impact, to make the real transformation, right? So it's about transforming data into sustainable social transformation. So it's challenging, but that's what we have to do, right? Pushing the boundaries all the time. So let's go to the case. It took place in 2017 when the state of Maranhão, it's a hot spot in Brazil in terms of labor exploitation and worst forms of exploitation, human trafficking. And the governor of Maranhão entered into 2017 in a compliance commitment agreement in our office to launch a new evidence-based policy on prevention of human trafficking. At the heart of this commitment is the knowledge base produced within our prosecution office, sort of trying to escape that traditional law enforcement model, using paper and investigation based on paper and requesting tons and tons of papers, And we have created, since 2015, we have started to create a data lake that stores full-time series databases with individual level records regarding formal jobs, social security, census data, service data, and so on. So before the agreement, other investigations were in place, but without any success in negotiations would lead to a civil lawsuit. However, the evidence-based research produced showed not only the prosecutors but to policymakers that Maranhão, I'm going to show you some of this, should be a priority due to the quantitative and qualitative data that we have gathered in relation to the characteristics of the vulnerabilities there, of the vulnerable populations born in the state. So from 1995 to 2016, more than 8,000 workers, 1/5 of the total human trafficking victims were born in the state of Maranhão. So, and most have migrated to poor living standards, poor living conditions. We have demonstrated the problem by indicators for each municipality in the state, such as extreme poverty, educational achievements, life expectancy, and employment, and etc. So, with this evidence, a group of prosecutors brought new life to the investigations that were ongoing investigations. And several strategies were used. We promoted seminars involving the ILO, national NGOs, superior court judges, inspectors, and federal government representatives. After this moment, especially with the use of the data to demonstrate the granular characteristics of the vulnerabilities of the problem within each municipality, the case gained a new impetus until the state government agreed on entering into the cooperation agreement in our office. I'm almost finishing. The obligations assumed by the state concerning the new policy are based on receiving information from the data hub, to boost the implementation of the plan. So we're sort of trying to move forward real-time policy making. It's ambitious, okay, it's a bold statement, say something about something like that, but we have to push the boundaries, right? This way of creating a repository where we can store data and transform data into information for policymakers sort of prevents placing all the burden on one branch of the government, which is really important, and creates a system in which we can share knowledge and foster accountability, transparency, and social control. Because we have put all the information in a place like this. It's it's an observatory it's difficult to say, but we have the map of Brazil with the position and information on the hotspots, and lots of disaggregated census data and survey data, and all the information that a policymaker in a specific municipality needs to understand what's going on in the specific in the place that he's governing. So stop, right? Okay, now we're replicating intervention. We're monitoring the governor and the policymaking process to guarantee that the process will be able to scale up to other states and stuff like that. Thank you very much, and I'm open to questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm probably more interested in the questions. I always like engaging on that level a lot better. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. So I have an interesting role in the field. For lack of a better term, I'm a lobbyist. So I represent individual actors in the field to take care of the solutions that they want to bring forth and try to put them in public policy or to other solutions, whether that's a government putting in a law, whether that's a company taking a practice change, or whether it's a contingent of different groups all taking those actions. And it's kind of a flip side to what Luis is doing is the more where I've gone beyond that. So interestingly, the year I graduated from undergrad, I co-founded an organization which is now, I believe, called Worthwhile Go. I've since left. Our focus was we were very interested in raising awareness about human trafficking. We sent under-assuming college kids on bicycles to cover large thousands of miles distances to raise awareness about this issue in a pretty fun college way. But what I was interested in is, okay, if we're raising awareness about an issue, how are we going to connect people to that issue? And it's, for me, coming from the sector of the UN before that, was you got to give people something that's actionable, that's based in the reality, that's connected to them right there. So what we would do is we had to identify organizations on the ground who were dealing in firsthand with what was going on with wherever we are traveling, or wherever we are sending our riders. And so that therefore we could connect people directly to folks that knew what was going on and could provide them something to do that day. But as time went on, and as we were going through the process, it became really apparent that there were so many organizations that were out in their presence, but so few of them either knew about each other or connected or discussing or collaborating in some way. And for me, knowing how large of this issue is, it seemed negligent to do that at best and at worst. So for me, and then I very much sat in the issues. I'm sure many of you are sitting in things that you're considering working on of what do I do with my life. And I had lack of a better idea, so I was planning to move to China, and before I did, though, I started volunteering with an organization in Baltimore that served adult survivors of sex trafficking. And because I had a criminal law background, they're like, can you lobby for us or advocate? I'm like, sure, you're not paying me much, you've got nothing to lose, I'll pretend I can do this. And so we started working with them and just kind of regurgitating the same talking points that a lot of organizations were putting out there and sharing that with policymakers of like, this is what the issue is, this is what we should care about. But I got kind of really tired of that, and going back to what I had experienced of just how do we, I remember swooping my chair around that day, and and realizing that, looking to my boss and saying, what are you dealing with? What are the problems that you're facing today? What's grounded in your reality of the people that you're looking to serve? And we started working on legislation around college access and around homelessness and around substance abuse and around all these different aspects that were very absent from the conversation on the issue because folks weren't just simply being asked on their daily basis what's going on. And then over the years, I've moved more into a place of working independent of any one organization and working on behalf of coalitions and task forces and connecting with governments to discuss, okay, we're trying to solve this issue. So my position is generally in between all the folks that are on this table of saying, okay, great, you want to do this, you think that, how do we bring this together? And so the difficulty in that is it's how do you analyze what you know and how do you analyze what you don't know? And so my job is working with groups to assess, okay, this is what your reality is, but what are we missing from the conversation? Or within public policy based on human trafficking, It's, okay, great, we need to put these people in jail, we need to do work on these crimes. But when we're talking about the continuum of victims of trafficking, I'm a lot more interested in the question of who were they before they were victims of trafficking, 10, 4 weeks, 2 years down the road, and what will happen to them afterwards. And so there, within the issue of human trafficking, we encounter the nexus of all these different social issues. And I often look at it as human trafficking is the confluence of all these different social issues. When we don't care about them enough, when they then start interacting with one another, things like this happen. And so from a public policy standpoint, the difficulty is assessing how do you take action on this issue that is also respective of all the other issues out there. So one of the things that we've been doing, that a lot of task forces through me and then on their own have been doing to tackle this issue is how do we partner with people who are doing substance abuse work? How do we partnering with people who are dealing with immigration issues? How are we partnering with folks who take on money laundering and all these different aspects areas of looking at the issue more broadly than just what we're seeing today, but who can we all leverage to bring people together? And the difficulty in that is the space that I sit in, and I imagine many people sit in, is the personalities and dealing with how do you get people to work together? Are you able to bring people to the table and communicate and identify ways of partnership? Identify ways that it's not about tackling this thing or tackling that thing, it's we can do it all together.